Welcome to the Theology Nerd Podcast with the Dr. Tripp Fuller. This is a shorter Q&A episode where your friendly local internet theologian answers questions submitted by you. There are lots of ways you can submit a question for Tripp to answer. You can go to homebrewedchristianity.com, click the send voicemail button on the right-hand side near the scroll bar. You can also leave a 5-star review on iTunes and just put your question as the review. You can also tweet at Tripp Fuller, that's 2 P's and 2 L's. Or you can send an email with your question to mediaguru@homebrewedchristianity.com. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast and to our email list. That way you never miss out on new episodes or live events near you. Just go to homebrewedchristianity.com to learn more.
What is up? Well, guess what? I'm going to try to answer another question. The question this time from Alex is, what do I do with 4 different contradictory gospel stories? Now, here's the thing. I actually think, and this is what I want to do, I want to convince you that we should be glad the Gospels aren't lining up, that Jesus does different things at different times, says different things, has a completely different kind of character or way of rocking it out in the different Gospels. And here's why. And maybe this will help this little story. So I was in 5th grade, or maybe it's 4th grade. I don't exactly remember. I just remember the moment when I discovered that my Bible was broken. That's right. I was a Baptist preacher's kid, and as it got near Easter, I started reading the Bible, reading all 4 Gospels accounts of the end of Jesus' life, the Passion Week, from the entry to the temple scene to the washing of feet and such. And I charted it out. I kept notes and had this is what happens in Mark, and this is what happens in Matthew and Luke and John. And I realized a few things that gets me quite frustrated, that I call my parents and I said, look, I know you meant well. I know you're a minister. You probably didn't think about checking, but my Bible is broken. Jesus doesn't even die on the same day in the 4 Gospels. John is him dying on a different day. I don't know what happened, but I got a chart. And we all know the best way to get access to eternal biblical truths is drawing charts and putting Bible verses on it. And not only that, in John, Jesus washes feet. There's no communion. And the other, there's communion. What happens when the guards show up is completely different based on the gospel. In Mark, Jesus is like sweat and blood. In John, the guards come up with Judas and they say, where's Jesus? And he says, I am, like the name of God, I am. And they just fall on the ground. Because in John, Jesus isn't like scared and freaking out. He's in complete control. And he dies and says, it is finished. But then in Mark, he's like, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Matthew, dead people get up and go around the city, but not in the other ones. So, Jesus dies, dead people get up, go around the city in Matthew, not in the others. And I'm like, somebody needs to get Matthew, Mark, Luke, John together, sit down, get clear, because do you understand how hard it is to believe the Easter story? Just if you told one version, let alone 4, not even lining up. Somebody get the man an editor. They can work together, and I remember that experience and my parents saying, nope, it's not broken. They're different. That was the first time I knew that whatever it is that's getting itself unleashed in Scripture, or whatever is going on in these gospel accounts, it's not something you tell straight. the communication that's coming through is a type of indirect communication. It's not about what happens explicitly on the surface. And the church knew that. The church trusted these four different tellings of the gospel, and they canonized them. And from that point on, I kept wrestling with Scripture, and that's when I got into reading biblical studies and stuff, which I know most people don't do that in middle school and high school, but I've just been a nerd a long time, so it happened. So here's the thing: there's a couple excellent gifts realizing that gives you. Number one, you can look at your fundamentalist friends and that are real insistent that whatever it means for Scripture to be true means it's all lines up perfectly and everything has to happen, and they start coming up with weird ways to read everything so it all lines up and stuff. You can just say, no, I'm a biblical Christian. I know it contradicts each other. I'm just trying to trust the Bible and know that, to read it as a sacred text means you have to at least acknowledge that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John have different testimonies, and I'm too conservative to really go mess with it, and come up with one simple, seamless, organized, non-contradictory telling. I don't want to do that. I'm a biblical Christian trying to conserve Scripture for the people. And underneath that, right, I think the shock that we haven't been told that consistently and regularly in the church, and the threat that some people experience these kind of obvious pointers, right? I think that's what you were talking about in the question, right? It's very clear there are different accounts of Jesus here. There's something about our faith in our contemporary context that makes us drive towards simplicity, finality, closure, and the gospel text resist it. But it's not just our time that did that. So there's a guy named Tatian in the early church, and he was condemned as a heretic. Why? Well, one of the main reasons he was condemned as a heretic is he made what's called a harmony gospel. That is a gospel that takes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and makes one telling of the story where there are no contradictions and everything lines up, so that you don't have to have these four stories that don't really work well together next to each other. And so in the same gospel, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except by me. And don't call me good, only my Father is good. You could say those are two very different literary depictions of the Christ. But Tatian, like a lot of us, wants something we can point at and assent to and believe and go, yeah, see, I believe that, I trust that, it's right there. And it became popular, this harmony gospel, in the early church, that when the ecumenical council together, the leaders of the church all over, gathered and condemned this gospel and eventually end up canonizing the four we have. I think they were doing something really smart. They're saying the gospel story itself is not something that gets flattened out, so that the telling itself, that one version of it is not accurate alone. That it's more beautiful to have these four different testimonies that the church trusts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, canonized, brought into shaping the church's self-understanding, shaping our encounter with Christ. The church recognizes the presence of the risen Christ in all four of these texts, and yet they can't all be true historical accounts, but they can be true theological narratives that shape our encounter with Christ, our relationship with God, our mission and place and identity, and what we are to be in this world. And so the condemnation of Tatian is the condemnation of that drive for sameness, for singularity, for finality, for an organized surface explanation of faith. And that condemnation of Tatian is also the call to embrace a diversity of voices and expressions of the gospel, to recognize and wrestle with the different tenors and textures of an individual evangelist, an individual gospel writer. Theology nerds call them evangelists, an individual evangelist telling. And in one of the things that does, it means that when we take time to get to know Mark or Matthew or Luke or John, we're taking time to get someone's telling of this story, and you can engage it on its own terms. In biblical scholarship, it's called redaction criticism, where through a lot of nerdy tools, I guess we could talk about them later if you want, but you analyze a text, not just to see what happens in Matthew, but to see what are the specific, unique insights and affirmations or negations that are at the heart of Matthew's telling of the gospel. And how are they different or contradictory or expanding to Mark's or Luke's or John's? And so when we canonize foretellings, we're saying to tell the gospel, you have to tell it plural. Now, when you ask a question about what to do with it, one of the places those type of questions come from are when our faith experience in the congregations we're in are ones that also have an expectation, like kind of a creeping Tatianism, right? That there is one true, final, no contradiction telling of the gospel. And sometimes that's experienced because we're all supposed to believe these things, or we're all supposed to trust whoever's at the top or something like that. But I think part of the gift of a multiplicity of voices being canonized is the recognition that the gospel is deeper and more full in a multiplicity of confessions than it is in a uniform, non-contradictory accounts. And so in a sense, just having the New Testament is a protest to all congregations and communities of faith that insist the gospel can only be spoken one way or described in one way. That the church has already rejected a worked out, true surface account and insisted that the mystery of the gospel, the mystery of God as encountered through Christ, must be told over and over again. It must be told multivalent, multiple ways that are divergent and explore different themes from different contexts. And so to me, this just invites us to realize that each person in our congregation who knows themselves as known and loved by God, mediated by Jesus, that knowledge and presence of God is mediated by Jesus, that they too have something to contribute to how we as a church, as a community, tell the gospel. That if the church resisted having one account or a final account and insisted that each collection of scripture have divergent voices there, then maybe we too, in our context and in our day, can embrace and encounter a diversity, a plurality, and even a contradictory collection of voices. Now, after you realize that there are multiple contradictory, conflicting testimonies or accounts of the life and ministry, death, resurrection of Jesus in the New Testament, and that making them all line up isn't the goal of biblical engagement, then you get to fall in love with each gospel on its own terms. And I'm not going to introduce all four of them, but I think they're so cool individually that they highlight things and are posing questions the others don't. The other part of that insight, specifically for the question that you asked, is that when we get a text from John or we get a text from Mark or whatever, part of what it means to wrestle and engage that text is to notice what are the unique features of that gospel. What is it that is at the heart of that individual gospel and their telling? And sometimes a gospel response can come from another gospel. Like sometimes Gospel of John, high Christology. Like Jesus is basically knows he's God the whole time and runs around telling people it even though they don't get it. And in Mark, there's none of that. It's like very low Christology, like that Maybe at baptism, Jesus is adopted into God or whatever. And then he dies just with the "why have you forsaken me" bit. Well, sometimes there can be times in my life where there's no chance I feel like I belong in the church or that I could be a Christian if I'm expected to agree with the grandiose, cosmic, Christological depiction of Jesus in the Gospel of John. But I do know the apocalyptic, intense, yet doubting the real reality of what it is driving him picture of Jesus in Mark is something I resonate with. Maybe canon makes space for people with a giant diversity and collection of gospel tellings, and maybe we can do so in our congregations. And yeah, I'll stop there. But next time.